All right, and we're live. Want to share? Do you have the link?
You know what? I don't have the link. That is something that shows up on that in the creator studio. It's a little short link that shows up on the. Oh, awesome! You got it. You know what you're doing.
In the chat.
Perfect.
All right, I'll tweet that out.
Oh, wait a minute. What did I get before you tweet it? I think. Oh, it's just because I have restricted mode enabled. That's cool. All right. Actually, if you tweet it, I'll just retweet it. That's even better.
The math.bot?
It's mathbot_.com is the Twitter profile. Dude, you're killing me on Twitter.
What do you mean?
You got like over double my followers. Nice job, man.
Thank you. It's just from shit posting every day.
Nice.
All right. I just tweeted that out.
Cool. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you. I'll probably forget, but I'll hit you up later. Just about how you're doing your podcast and recording it and trying to get good audio quality because mine's terrible. And I need to get a podcast feed set up and try to find somebody that'll handle all that.
Yeah, it'll have to do with the mics. Looks like we got a viewer. Hey, viewer. Let's jump into it. I'll do a little intro.
Awesome.
What is up, freaks? Welcome back to Tales from the Crypt. It's your boy Marty Bent. We're here on a Wednesday afternoon. Very rare occurrence here on Tales from the Crypt as we do a live recording with our friend JW Weatherman. JW, how have you been?
Good, man. Thanks for having me back on. This is fun.
You're you're the only person that I will do these interviews with remotely up to this point. So
I appreciate it. It's a very big honor. I love you have the best guest on. I was listening to your interview with the Blue Matt just a couple days ago. So that's great. It's a hell of an endorsement.
Yeah, he's got some very, very cool ideas. If you guys haven't checked out his new Better Hash protocol, definitely find that on GitHub, read up on it, and try to convince mining pools to adopt that software and those protocols because it could very much lead to some decentralization of mining, which is a perfect segue into the conversations that we get into, which is the threat models of Bitcoin, one of them being technological, which I would argue is mining. We're going to get more into human threats this episode with you, but first, let's talk about MathBot, the new product that you've created that is trying to help people learn math and engineering, computer science, or excuse me, software engineering online. And am I correct in saying that people are incentivized by getting paid a little bit in Bitcoin?
Yeah, the basic idea is that we want to teach kids math and programming and adults also. And so you go to the website and you can program this robot to walk around, pick up blocks and count and, do division, all that good stuff. But it's not as fun as something that's like a purely entertaining game. So I worked on this starting a couple of years ago, and then I kind of shelved it until a few months ago when I got into Bitcoin, because when I tested it, I couldn't find a way to make a math game fun enough to compete with just like a first person shooter or a like Angry Birds or something. And I realized how like I should have known that out of the gate, right? Like trying to optimize for two things is pretty much impossible if you're competing with people that are optimizing for one thing. But to overcome that, the where Bitcoin came in and kind of resurrected the idea was that a parent or a grandparent or just really anybody could pay for a kid to learn something like how exponents work. And maybe it's $50 and they'll master exponents. And what we'll do is we'll pass on $45 to the kid as they pass different levels. So maybe there's, 15 or so levels. We would give the kid $3 in Bitcoin every time he passed. So it's basically a way to automate what a lot of good parents do, which is, hey, I'll buy you ice cream. I'll give you this if you learn that. The same reason that we're incentivized to do work. with a carrot instead of just public shaming or whatever the public schools are doing to try to get kids to learn how to fill out forms for the DMV. So yeah, that's basically the idea.
No, it's very interesting. So a great incentivization. I can't speak right now. System that you set up there. And so do you help the kids set up Bitcoin wallets that you send the money to right away, or?
We're trying to figure that out right now. And actually forever, you'll be able to play all of the levels for free. So if you don't want to pay, that's fine. You can do what a lot of parents do. Like if you learn how to program recursive functions, I'll buy you an ice cream, right? And you don't have to pay us anything for that. It's free and open source. Just use it. But being able to in the game reward the kids with Bitcoin is something that we haven't done yet. We really couldn't do it. We didn't feel like we could do it until Lightning was working, because if we're going to give $1 or 50 cents if they pass a level, depending on how hard the level is, the on-chain fees, it just doesn't make sense for that. So we're kind of waiting for Lightning to get a little bit further out there. I am waiting with bated breath for the first iPhone Lightning wallet. And huge fan of Lightning, obviously. And so that's where we're at. It's not there yet, but that's where we're headed.
Now it's interesting. Jack Mallers was teasing his iPhone Zap wallet last week. That looks like an interesting project. Very excited to see that get off the ground. And it's crazy to see how much innovation's been going on at Lightning in particular. Like it was vaporware 6 months ago, and now people are actually doing stuff with it.
Yeah, it's really game changing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In other words, there was a ton of code written, and you can actually test it a little bit. It's really, really awesome. I mean, I think we'll finally be done with all the scaling coins, which is, I mean, after you've been in the space for a little while, you're just so sick of talking about like Litecoin and Ethereum and all these things that exist because Bitcoin can't scale. So if nothing else, Lightning will give us freedom from all that garbage. But yeah, I mean, the first day that Amazon adopts it, or McDonald's or something, is going to be a really good day.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm not going to hold my breath for that, but no, it's interesting to see because there's different schools of thought of how these things should scale. I'm excited to see that Lightning's getting its light and day, and people are actually experimenting with it. Like things like Satoshi.place has been incredibly fun to watch. I feel like Bitcoin's a little bit weird again. People paying 1 Satoshi to draw on that site. Have you been to that yet, Satoshi.place?
Yeah. It's pretty funny, and I do think that it highlights micropayments really, really well, or nano payments, or whatever we want to call them. It's cool stuff, man. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think there is really any scaling debate. I don't think there ever was. There was like a bunch of idiots saying dumb things, and then there was, hey, we can do it on layer 2. And I don't think it's really ever been more than that.
I think some people would question the security of Lightning, especially in its current state. But long term, that's sort of an unanswered question. Is the tight security of Lightning correct?
I don't think so. I mean, for beta software, you should expect some bugs, right? And it's not finished yet. But from a security standpoint, what you want to worry about are design flaws. And at the end of the day, Lightning is just Bitcoin transactions that are creatively delayed. So there's not a whole lot of reason to believe that it's not going to be something that is secure. I think, there's going to be some edge cases and some things to work through, and it's going to evolve. But fundamentally, I think that it's really obvious at this point that the design is sound and that it will be a really good, secure payment network.
Yeah, I think it just passed 25 Bitcoin in total earned channels now. Small amount, but it seems like activity is definitely picking up. And I think what's most interesting is that, like, it's crazy to see what I wrote about Jack Mallers' tease, I believe it was yesterday, for my newsletter. It's just crazy. The kid didn't raise any money. He's just had his head down working, and has produced probably something with more utility and practicality than any ICO has up to this point, that has raised millions upon hundreds of millions upon billions of dollars.
Yeah, it makes sense because I mean, the problem with the ICO stuff is that it's not, they never intended to build any products, right? The product was tricking suckers into giving them their money, and it's worked beautifully. Like they delivered on everything that they intended to. Like EOS is a huge success. They've probably scored $100 million. I mean, it's not the 5 billion or whatever, but that's a pretty good scam. But to people that haven't like done any angel investing, they haven't been around Silicon Valley. This is all just like completely new to them. I can understand that it looks like the same thing when somebody like Jack is like, hey, I'm going to build a Lightning wallet, and somebody like with these scammers is like, hey, I'm doing an ICO. But if you've been around, it's not. There's like, it's obvious that there's just a whole different thing happening. So yeah, Jack's awesome.
Yeah, he's incredible. Jack, if you're listening, we need to get you on this podcast. But in particular, like, do you think all ICOs are like have nefarious leaders behind them that are looking to scam everybody? Or do you think there's just honestly confusion out there where people sort of don't realize that they're participating in something?
I think they all know that they're scammers. I think there's some possibility, right? Like I'll say it's theoretically possible that somebody said, hey, this is an interesting project, let's try to build this thing, and then they put something together, and then they just got drowned in dumb money and had no motivation to get out of bed the next day. It is somewhat possible, but I think that would be like maybe the first couple guys, maybe something like I don't know, Storage, or I don't know who the early guys that were doing these things that ended up getting a lot more money than, like maybe the DAO, right? Those guys could have fallen into that category where like the amount of money that they raised was just crazy. But I think we're way past the peak of that that sort of hype cycle. And so if you're launching an ICO and you've got, you've done a really good job putting the PR together and doing a good fundraise, I think you knew what the game was, right? Like you're not like the first guy to do it. You're like the 17th guy to do it. So you're probably just an all out and out scammer. And if you look at the inverse relationship between the amount of like legitimacy of a project and the amount of money raised, that holds pretty strong, right? Like if you raised $100 million, you probably didn't write any code at all. if you wrote some code, you probably only raised $10 million. So I think everybody kind of knows what the game is at this point, except for the people getting fleeced.
Yeah, there's it's for the mission we're on here is to help the retail investors get up to speed with the space and how it sort of is operated up to this point. But I mean, I talk to a lot of people, they really believe in this stuff and believe this is the funding mechanism of the future. And I think that there are crypto economic incentive systems that can be developed to sort of bootstrap a community and a network effect. I have not been sold, but I do think there are true believers out there. I just don't know whether they're misguided or evil.
Yeah, I do also think that like there's two different things going on here. One is everybody in play right now is a scammer, and two is this will disrupt the stock market, right? Like Silicon Valley will be disrupted because people will be able to raise money for projects directly, avoiding all of the accredited investor laws and just making it a lot easier to get in and get out and move things around. Like the idea of taking equity and putting it into a digital form is pretty obvious. I mean, and giving people the ability to basically sign their equity to somebody else digitally, that's pretty obvious too. So I do think those things are going to happen. And then, avoiding government restrictions, yeah, that's a no-brainer, right? So that's kind of what's going on with tokenizing equities or doing ICOs. The problem is that we have this massive amount of dumb money that's been created because governments have prevented people from making small investments and learning, when they're 15, doing buying a couple shares of the gas station down the street or something and losing, or maybe more directly applying to a lot of the ICOs. We've prevented people from being able to play a game of craps on the street corner and realize that the odds are not in their favor, right? And so there's this ignorance about like gambling and ignorance about investing that's been created by government over many decades, and now it's being unleashed on this new technology that is a legitimate. I mean, the actual nuts and bolts of what's going on here is fine, but the scammers are taking advantage of the fact that now they have access to all of this fresh meat that they haven't had access to before. And so, yeah, I mean, it's cool technology in a lot of ways, and it will replace equity or paper equity that's on a centralized exchange. Like, I believe that's true, but I also think everything happening right now is basically garbage.
Yeah, how do you see that happening in the future? That will happen like on top of Bitcoin or second or third layer, or will these equities have specific tokens, or will they basically be hash values that represent equity?
Well, I think Bitcoin is really, I mean, the most important application by far of Bitcoin is money. But fundamentally, Bitcoin is just this ledger, right, that allows you to uh, to to retain ownership of something digital and then assign some ownership of something digital to somebody else. So I think that the colored coin concept is legitimate. I think that it's probably going to be for stuff like stocks and not stuff like owning a car or whatever, but maybe it'll be for that too. I mean, it is kind of a fundamental tool that can be used for a lot of different stuff, and I don't really see any reason not to use Bitcoin. Like, the best argument is that it's overkill from a security standpoint, and I agree. But if it's possible to combine Lightning with something like colored coins, where you can have essentially a token on top of Bitcoin and be able to transact that and then move that around for really low fees, like, why not, right? It's easier, and if you get more security than you need, that's not really a downside.
Yeah, and like you said, I agree that like I think securities like stocks, bonds, and stuff like that, they can definitely be digitized. Like nobody holds their stocks at home. Nobody prints them out and holds them at home. So I can definitely see that getting digitized. I don't know mechanics behind it, but when you talk about things like real estate and cars, that's where I sort of go like, I don't know. I don't know if that's going to work out because again, you have meat space. You can have something on the blockchain, but as soon as somebody can squat in your house and just say, no, this is my house now. Like the blockchain's not going to be able to show up at your door and enforce the contract. You always
Yeah.
need a third party.
Well, there is a huge difference between things that are purely digital, like Bitcoin, and things um, that represent assets, let's say, in the physical world. And that is that with Bitcoin, it is secure on the chain, right? Like, it is just secure. Nobody can steal it from you. It's incredible. I think it's going to change the way that I think it's going to end human slavery in our lifetime. Like, that's how important I think that is. But it's also just convenient to be able to use Bitcoin for something like, let's say it is your house. It could be convenient. Now, I mean, there's downsides, right? Like if you lose your private keys and things like that, but we don't really have a better way to authenticate a human being other than possession of a private key. And so if we get to the point where we have, good backups, things like Jameson Lops project at Casa Hodl, I think is pretty awesome. But we're gonna solve the private key management thing eventually. We're more motivated to do it than we ever have been before, thanks to Bitcoin. And so I could see it just being convenient and easy to have a token that represents a piece of real estate. Now, the problem that you're pointing out is that it can't be secured in any way by Bitcoin, right? Like, you can secure the movement of that token, but that's, who cares about the movement of the token? What you really want to secure is possession of this piece of property. And until we have a good private defense system and can compete with government monopolies, you're still going to be dependent on whatever corrupt system you happen to reside in for that. But it still could solve the accounting problem, right? Accounting problem is a bit of a pain in the butt, so it's still useful, but it's not revolutionary like something that is super hard to steal, and being a new digital cash.
Yeah, that's where I think a lot of people are getting confused is they don't realize the novelty of a new money, and they're trying to attribute the characteristics of Bitcoin to other things where it's just not as valuable in those other instances in my mind. Like money is such a bigger use case than anything that anybody else is comparing this stuff to at the moment.
Totally.
Um,
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
and and we're going to segue here. One thing you touched on about 30 or 45 seconds ago is that you believe Bitcoin is going to end human slavery in your lifetime, our lifetimes. We touched on slavery and your concept of slavery in the our first interview a few months ago, whenever that was. I think it might have been like February. But let's rehash it, like short rehash of your definition of slavery. It's definitely very heavy for some people to understand and sort of grasp, and then get into why you believe Bitcoin is going to fix this problem that you
Yeah,
perceive.
totally. Somebody sent me Webster's dictionary definition of slavery, and it was actually much closer to my definition than I expected, since that's available in all the mainstream bookstores. But my definition of slavery, and I think the only, to be fair, the only viable definition of slavery that I've heard. So maybe somebody can come up with something better, but I haven't heard it yet. That accounts for all of the different forms of slavery, all of the different circumstances throughout history, and just creates a reasonably clear thinking concept. Is you are a slave if somebody can take your property without your consent. So if you're the ants in Bug's Life, right? They're running around in that Disney movie, and they're trying to get ready for the locusts that are going to come every spring or whatever it is and take their stuff. Those guys are slaves because they are working under the threat of violence to produce and then hand that off to somebody that will beat them or kill them if they don't do that. So I think that's a good definition of slavery. A lot of people are okay with it until the implications come, right? The implications of that definition of slavery is that everybody in the United States of America is a slave right now, because taxation is fundamentally saying, if you don't give me your stuff on a regular basis, I'm going to beat you and put you in a cage. So I get that the patriotism thing, gets a little bit wonky and emotional. But at the end of the day, I haven't heard a better definition, or even another viable definition for slavery.
Is there any level of taxation that you see as viable?
Uh,
Like,
I mean, viable as in ethical, I think, or so
yeah.
my
So like
definition of
basically,
slavery is not like, I don't like it when things are on a gradient necessarily, right?
mhm.
Like if I say that you're a slave because people take your stuff without your consent on a regular basis, I feel like that's a pretty clear definition. But if I say, you're only a slave if you're mistreated and your stuff is taken from you, or you're greatly mistreated and your stuff is taken from you. It's like, well, what does greatly mistreated mean? Like, was somebody that was like a house slave not a slave because they got to live in the nice part of the house and eat good food, or were the people that were in the fields, they were slaves, if we're using like racial slavery in the South. I think that that's not really what there is. An idea that we're trying to communicate when we say slave, and I don't think that it is an idea that is a gradient. I think there's a difference between being free and being a subject, being a slave of somebody else. And there's different degrees of like emotion associated with words, but there is a fundamental definition, I think, that's important when we use words like that. And so no, I would say, even, I mean, let's use the Bug's Life thing, because it's maybe less emotional than talking about being a citizen of the land of the free, home of the brave. In the movie of the Bug's Life, do you consider those ants slaves of the guys that come by on a regular basis? And if so, how much stuff do they have to be taking from the ants before they're no longer slaves? For me, it's binary. It's like, if they have to hand over, uh, just a small tribute or take a beating, I would say that they're still a slave by a reasonable definition.
Yeah. No, again, we touched on this in the first time we talked to it. Is people do get sketched out by even the word. It's like, Joe Rogan, one of his first stand-up specials, he talked about a couple words that like just trigger the hell out of people.
Yeah.
Slavery is definitely one of them. And just to be clear to everybody out there, we're not focusing on human slavery. We're focusing on, the physical human slavery of the, like it was in the South back then. We're talking about more abstract concept. Well, I would call it more abstract, right? Or
Well, I don't know. Like even in racial slavery in the South, which is like the only thing that we can hear, like that's the only form of slavery that American ears are allowed to process, right? Like even though this is an institution that goes back, thousands of years. And we have even the Exodus story as a story about slavery, right? But we can't really call that slavery as an American. We're only allowed to think about racial slavery in the South, or because we gotta worship Lincoln for ending it. But I would say that even in that environment, there were slaves that had varying degrees of freedom. And some of the slaves were like overseers, and they oversaw slaves that were miles and miles away from the slave owner because the slave owner had security concerns, right? He didn't want to have his throat cut in the middle of the night. And so it was very common to have like, the fancy house be far from where the actual slaves lived and worked and functioned. And in that environment, like the slave owner wasn't really around much. And the overseers were often slaves themselves. Um, so were those guys not slaves because maybe they were treated better or had a little bit more autonomy? I don't think so. I think you can have varying degrees of cruelty involved with slavery, but the word, if it's going to have any meaning, has to have a reasonable definition that accounts for all of the different forms of slavery.
Yeah. Cool. So how is Bitcoin going to end our current form of debt slavery here in America?
Yeah, I think what we have globally right now is systems like I wrote a document called the human threat model, is what I called it after I did the Bitcoin threat model. And it basically outlines the mission of humanity and all of the different ways that you could hinder it. And the different some of the different forms of slavery, essentially, because that greatly hinders human productivity. When you take people's stuff, they don't want to produce as much, they don't want to solve as many problems. And one of them is what I call monopoly slavery, and that's where instead of coming by and like taxation slavery is where I come by regularly and I take a portion of your belongings or a portion of what you've produced. Monopoly slavery is when I force you to use a service, and I'm able, as a result, to charge monopoly prices, and so I extract wealth from you. For example, if you wanted to mail a letter and there's no competition allowed with letter carrying, that you're going to pay more than if there was competition, and then that difference is essentially theft, right? Because under the threat of violence, you're being forced to not provide the service and not engage with anybody else to provide the service. So there's a bunch of different ways that are most cost effective to steal your belongings right now. And Bitcoin makes a lot of those more expensive and less profitable. So the obvious one is monopolizing the central bank or monopolizing money creation, right? Where you have to use the US dollar, and that gives them the ability to print dollars and give it to their buddies and essentially steal your savings account, right? And they do it at a rate that's bearable most of the time, but sometimes, think about every 25 years or something on average, the governments get a little ahead of themselves, a little excited, and they print so much money and give it to their buddies that you have hyperinflation, like in Venezuela right now and Zimbabwe before that. And it's government currencies don't have in general a very long lifetime. So that is a way of stealing people's savings. And if it hyperinflates, you've stolen all of their savings, right? Like you made their savings completely worthless. But if you steal, 3, 4, 5% per year, then you can, it's a long con versus a short con situation. Bitcoin makes that impossible because it breaks the back of the monopoly, right? It allows people to have something that doesn't get stolen from them, and over time, it's inevitable that people will choose that and not choose the thing that is more often stolen.
Yeah, no, I think I just saw a crazy stat fly down my tweet deck probably like a half an hour ago, 20 minutes ago. Shout out Urban Arson, talking about if you were a Venezuelan who bought Bitcoin with bolivars in December when the price was at 20K, even though the price has crashed greater than 60, 70%, you would still have more money than you would have in bolivars in December. So the price is hyperinflated there so quickly that even though the price of Bitcoin in US dollar terms has crashed 70%, the value that Venezuelans had stored over that time period would still be worth more in bolivar terms.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I mean, the reason that Bitcoin is so volatile is that it's still experimental, it's new. A lot of people don't understand it. The trend overall is insane, right? I mean, over the last 9 years, it has just been crushing the US dollar. But the volatility is still a problem to use. Has a very secure, safe store of value. But that volatility is going to decrease with the overall amount of wealth that's put into it, just like gold and other things like that. So there will be a time where there's so much wealth in it that there's two things that happens. One is that everybody knows what this thing does, right? Like uh, when a new technology is invented, it's oversold, it's undersold. There's all kinds of confusion. There's like people getting crazy that it's going to happen tomorrow, and then people getting super depressed it's never going to happen. So all of that has to get worked out, right? Like the market has to absorb what is Bitcoin, how does it work, what problems does it actually solve for me and for my neighbors, so that I know whether it's a good investment or not. I think most of the volatility is in that. But the other thing that has to happen is that when somebody has a bad week, they get diagnosed with cancer or something, and they have $10 million in Bitcoin, and they decide they need to cash out because they don't want to deal with any little bit of volatility. That affects the market a lot right now. And so over time, as the market gets bigger, those individual events in people's lives won't have as big of an impact on the price of Bitcoin. So those two things seem to be, very much on track. And headed in the right direction if you zoom out more than a year or so.
Yeah, do you have any thoughts on how adoption happens going forward? Like I've said, that Bitcoin really won't come onto the scene in earnest until there's like a big currency crisis, not even a stock market crisis, because during a stock market crisis, people have to sell their Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies for cash to spend in the economy if they get laid off, if there's ever a recession or depression. I am under the belief that Bitcoin adoption won't happen in earnest until there's more Venezuela's, Argentina's, there's more currency crises around the world, and it's really hard to time those specifically. I'm just curious to see how you think adoption plays out going forward. Do you think we need something like that, or do you think there will be other catalysts that sort of drive adoption?
Well, I think like let's imagine that these are just two competing companies, right? Bitcoin is trying to solve a problem, and let's pick the very best competitor at Bitcoin, which I think is the U.S. dollar, right? It's been the most stable over the last 100 years. It's deflated, or it's inflated the least, relatively speaking, to any other currency. So let's just think about how, if they're both providing a service, how they're going to do just based on their performance if nothing else changes.
Can I interject? I would say the Swiss franc might be a stronger currency over the same time period than US dollar.
I think you're right, but they've made some changes in the last 10 years that would
yeah, they were on a pretty strict gold standard till recently. That screwed them off. They went off of it.
Yep. Yeah, I think you might be right. But we'll use the U.S. dollar because it's the biggest, and I don't think that those guys are going to. I mean, ultimately, I think that had a lot of money, and this is probably what did happen, a lot of money flow from the U.S. dollar to the Swiss franc. At a certain point, the U.S. government gets pissed off about that and makes some phone calls and puts the kibosh on the competition. So, but yeah, so the U.S. government, I mean, depending on your theory of monetary policy, it's got the biggest military by far. It has had a pretty good track record. So let's use that, but maybe there is a better competitor. But either way, I think I'll stack everything in favor of the U.S. dollar. So let's say that the U.S. dollar hasn't been printed like mad over the last few years, which we know is not true. And let's say that we're not experiencing the highest inflation that we've experienced in a long time, just for the purposes of this argument, right? Like we'll give the U.S. dollar every benefit possible. Let's say that it is going down in value at 2 to 3% per year, which is what the Fed, like the line, yeah, exactly, the lying mouthpiece of the government is trying to tell you how great this product is. That's what they say. They say that it goes down, 2 to 3% per year, and that's what they're trying to do. Now, what that means is, and there's all kinds of, like, if you haven't read the Bitcoin Standard, I know you have, but if anybody's listening and they haven't, your interview with him was awesome, by the way. Good job.
Thank you.
Yeah, really good book that talks a lot about how the CPI is actually manipulated, and they actually change what's in it so that it's not a good measure of what's going on. So let's say that instead of 2 or 3%, they're actually stealing maybe 4%, right? And I think that's probably very generous. But you got to understand that when they're stealing 4%, they're stealing not just that 4%, but they're stealing all of the human productivity that would have resulted in the goods and services that you want being cheaper. If you buy a pair of tennis shoes this month and you buy a pair of tennis shoes in 10 years, the tennis shoes in 10 years should be much cheaper because we've built a lot more technology, a lot more tools, a lot more factories, a lot of human creativity has gone into being able to produce the same level of quality shoe for less money and research, right? Actually 4% higher. Not only has that 4% been stolen, but all of that work that went into, in actuality, making the shoe less expensive has been stolen as well. But you can't really see that, and it's not easy to measure. So let's say that they're stealing, let's just give it 1% more for that, which I think is, man, we're stacking things in the favor of the Fed as much as we could. So let's say they're stealing 5% per year, and the value of the dollar is going down, accordingly. Now let's look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin works better as money in every possible way than the US dollar, just from a utility standpoint. Like, I can store it easier, I can send it easier, it's harder to steal, it's more subdivisible, it's easier to hide, it's easier to transport. Like, whatever you could want from a money, Bitcoin is better than the US dollar, just as far as actual functionality goes. It's irreversible, right? Like, if I give it to you electronically, you have it. Whereas if I give you a US dollar electronically, I can take that thing back for maybe 6 months, right? That's not attractive as somebody receiving dollars. So it beats it on that front, and it's not stealing 5% a year from you. How long would you expect it to take for that company, right? Let's say it's companies providing these services, to beat out the competition? 10 years at most, man. I mean, and that is stacking everything in favor of the US government. That would be my estimate. Like, 10 years is probably
10 years from here.
10 years from here.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is that what we're really fighting against is just people understanding, because money is complicated, right? So it's really an education lag.
Yeah, and that's the point. It's like, and that's probably like my biggest or not apprehension, but my biggest knock is, like, is it possible to educate everybody? Do people want to learn? Do people care? Or is there too much of a sunk cost into the system that they've been born into, that does it, are the incentives there for your average Joe to adopt this? Like, or are people just comfortable with their lives and willing to put their heads in the sand?
I mean, I would say that would be a more viable question like 10 years ago, before Bitcoin was invented, right? But how much adoption have we seen over the last 2 years, and how much education has happened over the last 2 years with Bitcoin? And a lot of that is because of the price, but the price has this effect of drawing in a ton of people. I mean, the number of people that know about it today has got to be 100 more than the number of people that knew about it 2 years ago, maybe. Maybe it's not that much. Maybe it's only 10 times more that know about it today than knew about it 2 years ago. That's freaking a lot. Like, that's a really good clip. So I think everything.
They know about it, but do they understand it? There's a difference, right? People don't know what money is. Like, that's what I was talking about with Safe, is like, do people don't know what money is? Like, they should read his book, because he lays it out in the history of it, and does an incredible job of describing what money is.
People don't know what potatoes are either, right? Like, people don't
know. What do you
mean? Well, I mean, do you know the chemical makeup of potatoes? Do you know how potatoes are manufactured? Do you know the different breeds and the history of how we've ended up with the potatoes that we have today? Now, they taste good. You eat them. You like to throw them in oil and chow down with a beer, right? So people don't understand hardly anything of what they use to solve problems. They just know that it works.
You have a potato fetish, I would say. The one video I was watching before this, you were talking about French fries. I forget which one it was.
Well, I'm learning more about myself in this video than I expected. I didn't realize I used potatoes. I thought I used
No,
carrots. I got to use carrots more.
I've seen
Okay.
no, but I understand where you're coming from. Yeah, people, it just is a better thing, so people will naturally adopt it over time.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people are going to get into Bitcoin just because of the price rises. They're going to be dumb money and they're just going to chase the price. But over time, they'll chase the price rise into Ethereum and Ripple, but that is going to go to zero, and it's going to be revealed as just a silly nonsense. People that chase the price rise into Bitcoin, if they don't leave, they might go down 70%, but they'll probably be just fine within a couple of years. And if you just if the current pattern continues, that's why I'm kind of surprised that you're thinking that we have to have some major crisis, because if the current pattern just over the last 2-3 years repeats itself 2 or 3 more times, we're already there, and we haven't really had any major crises that have driven it to this point.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I guess I'm just impatient. No, but no, that's a good point you bring up about. I just lost my train of thought.
That's all right.
Oh yeah, you were talking about Ethereum and Ripple. So there's people that really believe that these altcoins compete with Bitcoin. Like, what would you say? Do they compete? Like, is there a viable space for experimentation? Like, what do you think about the whole experimentation argument from people running altcoins and ICOs and stuff like that? Do you think experimentation is needed? Do you think it's good? Do you think it's bad? So you're talking about Litecoin earlier. You think it's the best scam coin because it's the most subtle?
Yeah, I mean, the experimentation argument is interesting, and it really just shows that that a lot of the people in the space are just easily fooled, right? Like, you can come up with a lot of silly narratives that wouldn't work if the people that were investing in these companies, right? They're not companies; they're digital assets, right? But the people that are investing in these digital commodities, let's say, if they had any expertise at all, none of these narratives would work, right? So, like, the idea that Ripple is going to blow up in a useful way, that would be like if you walked into a room of physicists and they're working on the Manhattan Project, and you're like, "Hey, check this out. I've got this truck and it's full of gas, and I've got this other truck and it's full of chickens, and I'm going to drive these things at each other at 60 miles an hour, and we're just going to see what happens. And I think we're going to learn something." Like, the physicists would, "What are you talking about? This makes no sense. Like, this experiment, can you even articulate what hypothesis you have, or what technology is involved here that might in some way enlighten us about the nature of the universe? Like, what are you talking about, man?" That is exactly how most people feel that are competent technologists when they look at, like, Ripple. Like, no, you're not doing anything. Like, I promise you, I will learn nothing from the way that this blows up, because there's nothing happening here. Like, this is just nonsense.
Yeah, I think Ripple in particular, they better watch out for the SEC. When the SEC dropped those guidelines, what they define as security in the crypto space in particular, Ripple checked all the boxes. So good luck to the Ripple team there.
Yeah. And I mean, the EOS team, the Ethereum team, the Litecoin team, the IOTA team, the Cardano team, the Verge team, like, just because people are interpreting something the SEC said as Ethereum is not a security, like, these people are confused about the nature of how this works. Like, this is the legal system, and especially when it comes to, like, securities and all of that, this is just a veiled proxy of political will. And if you cause people a lot of financial loss and they're politically connected, they're going to get you. That's the reality.
Let's get into that, though. Like, do we want the government intervening in this stuff, or should we just let it fall on its face? Like, I would agree that I think some of these, most of these tokens are securities, but I don't know if I want the SEC coming in, defining them, and then regulating and convicting people, especially if you're truly in this for, like, anarcho-capitalist reasons. Like, what are your views on that?
So, I mean, Well, there's a couple things. There's like what I want to happen and what I think will happen, right? So
Mhm.
what I think will happen in the reality of the world that we live in is that the legal system is a thinly veiled piece of PR on top of political will. And if you're connected, you get what you want out of the system. If you're not connected, you don't get what you want. And guys in muumuus that have very solemn faces do their best to convince you that that they're just following the letter of the law. And that's what's happening, right? So whether Vitalik ends up in jail for securities fraud or not, it will have almost nothing to do with anything that you could possibly justify as like crime, right? It won't have any relationship with victims really, or justice or anything like that. So that's the world as it is. And that's how I think that the stuff will play out. If the guys have the right amount of money and they've given it to the right people, they'll be safe. If they didn't pay off the right folks or accidentally burned the wrong rich person that is more politically connected, they'll suffer, right?
Yeah, that was interesting because A16Z and Union Square Ventures, I believe, went to the SEC on behalf of Ethereum, basically begging them not to label it a security because their portfolio is pretty over leveraged in Ethereum and their ICO counterparts.
Yep, totally. I mean that ultimately it won't prevent Ethereum from going to zero because it's a piece of garbage. And when it does, then we'll find out if they did the right thing, right? If Union Square Ventures, they probably don't have to worry too much about going to jail for promoting a security to unlicensed investors or unqualified investors or whatever. But the guys, like Vitalik and the other folks that are the front men, those are the guys that are the first to go down. And I wouldn't be sleeping well at night if I was those guys. And they know the game. They know they need to keep a big enough war chest to be able to make the people that are politically connected whole if they get burned. But I don't know if they're going to be able to play it well. I do know that a lot of little people are going to get hurt in the process because there's no value to this piece of garbage. But yeah, how it plays out is a little bit of a guess. Now, if you're asking me how I would like things to play out as an ANCAP or as somebody that believes in justice and wants a functional legal system, I don't want there to be securities laws. Like securities laws make zero sense at all. That's
why's that?
Well, I mean, they caused this problem, right? The idea of if you don't make at least $2 million a year as a couple in the United States, you are not allowed to invest in the gas station down the street. That has forced these people to put their, and also you're not allowed to save money in any meaningful way because we're going to steal it at a rapid rate and everybody's going to know it, right? Like nobody wants to keep their life savings in US dollars. That's obvious. So that's created this situation where your average person that just wants to be competent at his work has to be dumb money investor. They have to be somebody that gives their money to some idiot that works for some stock brokerage and stuffs it into a 401k, and then it just gets sloshed around in this massive pool of corruption. So these people have been trained that that's their only option. And now you have these tokens that come out, and at least, I know I'm getting screwed in the stock market. I'm not exactly sure how it all works, but I know I don't like it. And now I have another option. Yeah, fees or yeah,
fees. It's basically fees.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not. It's also just I get your money, right? Like if I have a publicly traded company, if I can get listed on the stock exchange, I get your money and I get to do with it what I want because you can't give it to anybody else because you're not allowed to hold it because I'll inflate. The government's going to inflate the hell out of it. And if you try to invest it in any company that is not part of our boys club, then the person that lets you invest it is going to go to jail for securities fraud, right? Or for promoting an unregistered security. So yeah, I mean, it's not just the fees. I get your money, like I get your life savings, and I get to do with it as I will. If I'm one of these publicly traded companies, and I get to use it to prevent competition, right? Like if I can get money 10 times cheaper, if I'm Microsoft and I'm publicly listed and I can get money 10 times cheaper than any software startup in Silicon Valley that's not yet publicly listed, then it creates this really interesting system where all I have to do is acquire anything that's useful, and it's suddenly 10 times more valuable. Right? There's a reason that this all this corruption hangs together, and the root of it is that dumb money that's being pushed into publicly traded companies, and literally has very few other places to hide and run to. So that's a huge problem. That's actually the root of the problem. Like the SEC created this problem. The U.S. government and the intervention in the economy has resulted in all this dumb money, and now there's a little bit of a relief valve, and people are running for it. And they've been trained to be very, very stupid and foolish investors. So that I would like to see that not increased. I'd like to see that eliminated. And then the other thing that as somebody that wants a functional justice system, I would like to see people prosecuted for fraud. If you're Vitalik and you say that this is a world computer and it had no chance of being a world computer, I want you to have to make restitution payments at minimum for the rest of your life to all the victims that you screwed over. So I don't think we're going to have that anytime soon, but very possibly in our lifetime, right? I mean, I do think that's a risk. If I was a scam coiner, I'd be thinking, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of corruption in the system right now. Maybe I can handle it, but can I handle the possibility that corruption gets washed out over the next 15 or 20 years and I'm still going to be around?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm on the side. I don't think any of them are going to go to jail. I don't know. I take the. Do you think? I don't think these people are malicious. These people. I don't think.
So let me pick everybody's favorite nice guy. So Charlie Lee, when he launched Litecoin, and I've gone back and I've read, the stuff that he posted about it. When he launched Litecoin, it's fast. It has more transactions per second than Bitcoin, and we have faster block confirmation times. It scales better. It is the silver to Bitcoin's gold, right? Mm-hmm. Do you think that when he knew that all he did was make an exact copy of Bitcoin, and he knew that 2.5 minute block times instead of 10-minute block times, all he had done was just like, I'm going to do a quarter as much hash power for the first confirmation? You think he didn't know that it still took 10 minutes to get the same amount of security on a transaction? Come on, man. Like, he must have known, right?
And little known fact, Litecoin was the first ever pre-mined altcoin. Only 50 Litecoin, but it was a pre-mined. But yeah, it's interesting. And but what about the open source nature of this? Like, shouldn't people be allowed to experiment with this stuff? Like, just the fact that the code is open.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's no problem with forking Bitcoin and screwing around with it. The problem is when you lie about it and you say that it's valuable. If you deceive people about the nature of your product and they buy it, that's the definition of fraud, right? That's you don't have to be a genius or like a philosophy major to know that is essentially punching somebody in the face and taking their stuff. You're just doing it with a different mechanism.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm playing devil's advocate here. I mean,
no, I know.
Because if you look at the site that the SEC put out, like the Howie Coin site, to basically mock ICOs, tell them that, hey, you guys are securities in our mind. Like, it looked a lot like the Ethereum pre-sales site. Like, hey, if you buy within this window, you'll get it at this price. If you buy in the next window, you'll get it at that price. And there is an expectation for that token to accrue in value over time. And it was sort of put together by the Ethereum Foundation, a centralized entity. It wasn't like they pretty sure they have an LLC or a nonprofit.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the Howey test, like I said before, the whole idea of having to be an accredited investor in order to make an investment in a company, unless it's part of our special select group of government endorsed, publicly traded, registered securities, that whole concept is flawed. But if you were going to try to apply something like the Howey test across the board, there's all kinds of stuff that would be considered a security, right? Like a lot of these laws are specifically written to be vague and to be unclear, so that when the political will exists to go left or right, it's not hard to do so. And I think the Howey test is a great example of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of interpretation there.
Right.
So let's get more into the human threat model. specifically when it relates to Bitcoin. Like what do you have to say about that? I know you wanted to talk about that. Because you've written about that since we last spoke.
Yeah. So I think there's a few things that that are interesting about it. One is that, and we've talked about this a bit already, but one is that Bitcoin is such like a fundamental change. So when you're describing like anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism or voluntarism or whatever, one of the most obvious objections is, okay, well, if you got your little Ancapistan, Montana secedes from the Union and becomes an independent country, and then you don't have a military, you don't have police, you don't have people that are showing up demanding protection money at the point of a gun on a regular basis. What's to prevent China from invading and then turning you back into a slave population? And the answer that I think, like Murray Rothbard and other guys that I really respect, there's a couple different answers, but one of them is, well, look, worst case scenario, you end up becoming, you end up under a state again, right? Like that's not an argument for the state, that under the worst case scenario, you end up part of a state. And I think there's some truth to that. But on the other hand, I think it's kind of a trick that I've used to prevent myself from really answering the question. And the real answer to the question is, we don't know, right? Like we don't have an answer for that. Like the truth is that's probably exactly what would happen. Now we have theories about how insurance could work and how we could create a system where it's not cost effective to invade. But I think the fact that nobody's ever been able to pull it off successfully, and there's no projects that are ongoing right now that think that that's possible. I think that shows that defense is too expensive right now. Like it is not cost effective to prevent yourself from being subjugated as an individual. And I think that's something that we should just look at and admit as ANCAPs. And it doesn't mean that it's like market failure or, some special category of thing. It's just like we don't know how to cure certain types of cancers right now, right? We don't have the technology that's required to prevent you from getting cancer and dying. And we also don't have the technology that's required to prevent you from being acquired by an attacker and then used as a sheep and fleeced on a regular basis systematically. There's too much profit in possessing you and taking your stuff on a regular basis. And it's not expensive enough to do that to where it's not cost effective, right? It is still profitable to be that sort of a slave owner. Now, you can't use just raw violence like you could have before because that's more expensive. You have to use central banking and you have to use certain types of taxation. You have to use, laws and things that are essentially all just PR to make it harder for you or make it less likely for you as the individual to get fed up and rebel, right? But at the end of the day, it still works. It's still very cost effective. And that's why it is an institution that exists around the globe. So I think the major insight of the cypherpunk movement was something that a lot of the ANCAPs didn't really connect with. And that is that it's fundamentally a technology solution to this problem, right? That we're not going to change human nature. Even though you indoctrinate a kid from the time that he's 4 into trying to make him into a socialist, human nature still remains pretty much the same. So those guys have failed at that. We're not going to probably solve this problem by education, right? Like the homeschool movement is very hopeful. There's a lot of things along those lines. And I think ANCAPs have primarily looked to education and said, look, if we can get people to realize that taxation is not legitimate, right? That you don't have a moral or a spiritual obligation to give a percentage of your wealth to this thug, and really help people internalize that, right? Because you've got the alliance between the church and the state encouraging all Americans to give their money, to submit to the government and all of these weird little corruptions. If we could just get people to understand that those are not legitimate and they're not true, then it wouldn't be cost effective to own them because they would avoid taxes more, right? And we're, arguably it's not the most profitable business in the world owning people. It's a relatively small margin operation. And sometimes things get out of hand and you have an uprising, right? And then things get real expensive for a while. So if we could get people to understand that they don't have to, quote, voluntarily comply, then we can knock the wheels off this thing. But I think that the cypherpunks had a better insight, and that is that it's not probably going to be through education, or at least historically, or looking forward. It doesn't look like education is going to be the key. It looks like it's going to be the advancement of new technology, like encryption. So the government needs, in order to keep this scheme going, they need to have control over communication, right? They used to be able to do it just by controlling the postal service and opening letters. Then they had complete control over the radio waves. Then they had complete control over television. So it's really important for the government to maintain control of that communication. The internet, and especially encryption, once that became a thing and was out there, and you and I could talk and we could prevent anybody from knowing what we were saying, I think the cypherpunks had the insight that the jig's up. Like, no matter what happens from here on out, the state's dead. We're just waiting for it to go through its final, death rattle. And I think they also looked towards Bitcoin and things like electronic cash and said, if we can pull that off, not only can we communicate, but we can actually exchange goods and services. We could create a digital Galt's Gulch in cyberspace, and that would allow us to essentially defund the government in a significant way. And I think they're dead on. I think they're right, and I think Bitcoin is going to be the thing that ultimately is the final straw.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I agree wholeheartedly with the notion that as soon as encryption was created and proliferated, it's like, all right, jig's up. It's just a matter of how long. But that being said, like, the transition to this system, like, people are so dependent on the government right now. People are so dependent on welfare and subsidies from the government. Like, what if this stuff was to go away overnight? Like, I think the scene would be pretty chaotic if that were to happen. Am I wrong in assuming that?
I don't know. I mean, I think about this quite a bit because I do think that we're going to see a major change in our lifetime of how society is organized and how we interact. I do think that we're witnessing the death of, like, if you live to see sort of the end of the city state and the arrival of the nation state, that would have been kind of, dramatic if you watch that play out. I think what we're going to see with the end of the nation state is so much more dramatic and so much more fundamental of a change that it's going to make that look like nothing. So I do think about how this is gonna work out. The longer that I've thought about it, the more comfortable I've got with it. And I think there's a couple analogies that I think of now. One is the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was providing everything that the Russian people wanted, right? Like, if you wanted toilet paper, you were getting it from the government. If you wanted a bite of food, you were getting it from the government. And I think as the Soviet Union was falling, there was probably a lot of people that were saying that same thing, like, whoa, how is this going to work? It's worse, right? It's worse than what we have in the United States. Like, everything was provided for those people from the government, and the government was going away. But what happened? The government went away. There was a little bit of chaos, but it wasn't absolute insanity, right? It wasn't zombie apocalypse. And within a few years, everybody was far more wealthy than they had been under the Soviet Union, because everybody was more productive. There was a greater desire to invest and to build tools and to just work, right? And I think that that's more likely. I don't know about the minor transition, or the immediate moments of transition, but I think it's going to be gradual, over the next decade, maybe 2 decades. And I think that we just greatly underestimate the amount of predation that we suffer under, because we do live in, like, such an amazingly prosperous time of history. And there's so much that we should be grateful for, right? Like, I'm super glad I didn't live 100 years ago as a free person, right? I'd much rather be here now and have a portion of my stuff taken every month with an MRI machine if I hit my head, right? Like, I really appreciate that stuff, and I don't mean to undersell it, but if 60% of everything that every American is producing is being consumed in all these really just destructive processes like foreign wars and the chaos introduced into the economy with the boom and the bust cycle, I think we probably just can't fathom how wealthy and how productive and how peaceful and prosperous the world would be without this current form of slavery.
No, I would tend to agree with you. Again, playing devil's advocate there, and it is going to take time. And I, like you said, I hope it is gradual, because I think there is like a palpable conscious awakening, if you will. People are definitely starting to question more. People are definitely throwing their hands up more, like, "Hey, what the fuck is going on?" I was promised the American dream, and that's sort of not happening for people, particularly in today's climate, today's world. People were sold, "Hey, you go to school, you go to college, you get a job." It used to be only the dad had to work, mom could stay at home, and now you need two incomes, and you're barely scraping by. So I think people are starting to throw their hands up, and, hey, this isn't what we were promised. Maybe there is a better way, and that's what I've been trying to push people towards. Hey, maybe you should look into Bitcoin. Maybe that can facilitate the better way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love what Safety says about it. When I think he was on with you when he said this, and education is great, but having just something that works better is even better, because it's inevitable, right? Like, as soon as the shovel was invented, it was inevitable that people were going to stop digging with their hands, and as soon as Bitcoin was invented, it was inevitable that we were going to drop government currency and go with it. And I don't know how far down the ladder we have to get. I don't know if we have to remove the ability to inflate the money supply and remove income taxes, right? Like, maybe the system will chug along a little bit longer, just purely based on income taxes. But again, Bitcoin's going to pull that one out too. So maybe it'll be somewhat gradual because of that, or maybe the whole system is so fragile right now, and I think this is very possible, that it's as soon as the central bank can't inflate the money supply, it's just going to be game over. But even then, it's not like if US dollars disappeared tomorrow, it's not like we're all going to be starving, right? Like, the food that is in the country is still here. The buildings are still here. The cars are still here. The oil refineries are still here. Like, all the stuff is still here. It might be a little chaotic to figure out how to use it, but I don't even know if it would be more chaotic than the 2008 financial crisis, because when we have those crises, what it means is that the economy has been completely confused, right? Like, we're investing in all the wrong things. There's malinvestment everywhere, because the money has been printed so rapidly, and now we're waking up from the hangover and going, "Oh my gosh, people don't want red tennis shoes. We better stop doing that. I don't know what we're going to do. Oh, it turns out we're going to can tuna," right? Whatever, right? During that period of like complete uncertainty and chaos, not knowing what people actually want us to produce, it's very, very, it's very unproductive, right? And they make it more unproductive by doing things like QE, where instead of just saying, "All right, we're going to have that moment where we don't know whether we should be canning tuna or making red shoes, and it's going to be unpleasant and it's going to be short," which we like one of the first depressions that we had in the United States was very much like that. It was like 3 months and people were back to normal. But
yeah, Safety talks about that in the Bitcoin Standard. I think it was like 1921 depression.
Yeah. It's hardly even referred to as a depression because it was so short-lived, but all of the numbers going into it were worse than what we call the Great Depression. The difference is that hangover was prolonged by essentially QE. So, the 2008 crisis was terrible. We had a lot of malinvestment. And then instead of letting us heal and figure out what the hell is going on, they printed a ton more money. And that continued to cause chaos and confusion, which persists till today, right? There's still a lot of stuff that we're building that people don't really want. We just haven't quite figured it out yet. So if that ends, maybe we'll just have, 2000 lasting. We'll be cranking.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it was an egregious disservice to the American people to expand the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve by 5x over the course of 6 years. That's what QE was. It went from 800 billion to 4.2 trillion, and that's absurd. And that's not sustainable. It's a matter of when, not if, and not going to try and time that. I've tried to time that many times in the past, and that's a fool's errand. But yeah, it's definitely not sustainable at all.
Yep, totally. So yeah, I mean, it's really good that we have an alternative, because it does feel a little bit like, we've maybe put together a really incredible spaceship just as the life raft was catching fire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, right. It is comfortable to know that we can have a transition, something to rotate into, need be. But we do have to figure out how to scale this shit if we are gonna bring the masses on. And that's why I agree with you. I hope this is gradual, maybe over the course of the next decade, 15 years, just so that we can scale this stuff in the meantime and make it so that it is as useful as possible and the utility is as high as possible for the greatest amount of people. Because right now, it's inarguable, the world can't adopt Bitcoin right now in mass.
I don't think you're right, man. I think the technology,
you don't?
I would argue the technology was ready even before Lightning, which
really,
yeah. And I think Hal Finney talked about this pretty early on. Like from the very beginning, they understood that you weren't going to be able to have every single transaction on the blockchain. And they talked about maybe there would be some kind of payment channel thing, but they also talked about just Bitcoin banks, right? And Bitcoin banks are not ideal, right? Like I'm not a fan of keeping your Bitcoin wealth on an exchange, but if I compare that to keeping your fiat wealth on an exchange, it's miles apart, right? So all we have to do is be much better than the competition. We don't have to be perfect.
I agree. So you're talking about like quasi gold notes via Bitcoin banks, Bitcoin notes, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, let's say that. Let's say that this is a terrible way to do it, and we can do much better. But just to try to make it as much on par as possible. Let's say that you have US dollars and they're printing US dollars like crazy and they're inflating the supply of US dollars, and you're putting your money in banks and they're operating a fractional reserve. So you put in $100, they lend out $2,000 or $1,000. And that's your only system, right? There's so many layers of corruption and craziness there. Not everybody knows about it, but a lot of people experience the effects of it. And then you have Coinbase, right? And Coinbase, God forbid it's going to get hacked. I'm sure it will. It's going to have its problems. I'm not a big fan of this system, but I'm trying to just say like apples to apples as much as possible. Let's say that you have this you have this Bitcoin bank. Well, they can't inflate the supply. They could do a fractional reserve thing, but we could also, if we give me this one additional sort of feature, we could make Coinbase prove to us that they have the Bitcoin that they claim, right?
I think that should already be in place. I think all these exchanges should prove that they're fully reserved, but it's a conversation for another day.
Yeah, totally. But I mean, that technology is available, right? It would be very trivial for them to do that. And then that system competes so much better with the US dollar, that the only reason that everybody hasn't run to Bitcoin and even for all of their transactions put their money in a Bitcoin bank, which again is not great, is just education, right? Because it's far better than what we would have had with the US dollar. Now, I think Lightning is awesome because it's going to be way, way better. And it's going to accelerate that education much faster and combat the FUD and all the nonsense and the negative ad campaigns and all that Bitcoin has suffered from. But at the end of the day, the technology 5 years ago was better than the US dollar in every possible way for money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. What do you say to the mainstream naysayers, the no coiners, if you will, that don't think this is possible at all?
I say, if you have heard everything that I have to say and you still think it's not possible, I want to encourage you to invest in Cardano, IOTA, EOS. Litecoin is really, really good because, it's more transactions per second than Bitcoin. It's Bitcoin Silver.
It's important.
Also, Monero, you should definitely buy some Monero because Bitcoin's never going to solve the fungibility problem. Even though we have Lightning and even though we can do mixing now really cheap and we've got all these, don't worry about that. Monero is the way to go. I want you to buy some Monero, go all in, and let's clean out this dumb money as soon as possible so that you stop causing economic chaos.
I actually think Zcash is becoming the anon coin of choice slowly but surely. I think Monero fucked up with that hard fork to cut out ASICs, and now people are bullish on Zcash.
Oh,
Zcash,
good. Yeah.
next,
Yeah. You
next
just have to,
fungibility coin.
right. Just trust that the Zcash guys, when they ran around and did that religious ceremony, that they didn't keep any of that keying material. And you're right. Zcash is totally better than Bitcoin.
Let's jump into that though. Fungibility. Do you think we ever get fungibility at the protocol level? Do you think it doesn't matter? Do you think plausible deniability is good enough? A good enough failsafe?
I mean, I think it matters, but again, comparing it to the existing competition, right? Like if you have US dollars, if you have paper dollars, maybe you could argue that you have better privacy, but almost nobody in the United States uses paper dollars for the majority of their expenses, right? Like very few people pay their rent or their mortgage with paper dollars. So if you compare it to the existing competition, I think Bitcoin is far superior from a fungibility or a privacy transaction standpoint than USD. If you talk about paper money, maybe it's better, but the hassle factor is so high that very few people are using it. And they're not stupid. They've eliminated all the high value dollar denominations, right? There's no $1,000 bill. There's no $500 bill. There's only $100 bills. So if you want to buy a car with $100 bills for privacy reasons, you're going to have enough cash to choke a horse with, right? It's very unattractive. And that's a great way to deal with privacy freaks, is just make it inconvenient so that only the privacy freaks will go through the inconvenience, and then it's easy to track through other means, right? It's easier to focus all your efforts. And don't forget that all these dollars have serial numbers on them, right? Like I still don't know exactly if there's any chance that the strip, because I haven't been interested in it. I only hear it from conspiracy theory people, so I discard it. But I don't know what's going on with the that little strip, if there is a micro number that you can read on it, but it doesn't matter because there's a big, huge serial number that's very easily machine readable on every bill. So if they felt like it, they can just have every bank scan in all of your deposits on your paper money and track things pretty easily that way. So I would argue that as it sits, Bitcoin is still better from a privacy and fungibility standpoint. And the only competition that we have that could actually claim to be better is so stupid in all these other ways that it can't possibly be used as money. So, I'm not trying to compete with Fantasyland stuff. I'm trying to compete with stuff that's a viable money that could scale, that could work in reasonable ways and has good quality technology. And then also, from there, look at fungibility as one of those aspects. And I think Bitcoin stacks up better than anything else, even as it sits now. And I'm not comfortable with it, right? Like I certainly wouldn't buy anything illegal with it.
Mm-hmm. Neither would I.
But I wouldn't buy anything illegal with bank transfer either, right?
Yeah, true. So let's keep steel manning this. What do you have to say to the people that think Bitcoin is the New World Order's secret plan to lead us to a cashless society, to monitor us all in a very Orwellian fashion?
Well, I mean, how could you do any better than what we have right now? Like, what are you marching us towards? You're marching us towards a place where if I take out more than a modest amount of money, I have to fill out a form and tell the government where I got it and where it's going, because that sounds terrifying. Or are you marching us towards a place where if the government wants to, they can flip a switch and I am instantly poor and I can't buy any food? Because I think we might already be there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what exactly are you afraid we're going to end up with? Because I'm pretty afraid of what we have now. I can't imagine it getting much worse. And then the other thing I would say is, like, if that's the plan, then they missed like some important economics lessons, which is possible because these people are not often the brightest. But if their plan is to like get us comfortable with digital cash and then force us to use Fedcoin, better find a way to hack Bitcoin and shut it down. And I'm not aware that they've found a way to do that yet, or I wouldn't be excited about the technology in the first place. And if free people are able to choose between Fedcoin and Bitcoin, we know from Gresham's law and just simple human nature that they're going to choose the one that works better. So yeah, how's that for a response to the conspiracy concerned?
pretty content with it. It was a good steel man. I think we just steel manned Bitcoin there in about 45 minutes.
Good
It
deal.
was a good job. Good on us. Good on you. Um, I do have to get going here in a little bit. Do you have like a parting note? Do you have anything you want to touch on in particular before we leave?
Yeah, actually, I would. I'm putting out a video a day on topics like this. So far, I think I'm 2 weeks into it. It's not easy. They're usually 15, 20-minute videos, but it's been going pretty good so far. I'm trying to stick to that discipline of publishing something every day. So if you want to follow me on YouTube, I don't have a cool URL yet, so you just have to go to YouTube and search for JW Weatherman. And then I definitely want to plug MathBot and say check out mathbot.com. Our mission is to put every public school teacher that teaches math out of work. We'll know that we were successful when you drive down the street and the folks that used to be teaching algebra are holding a sign that says, we'll work for food. And we want to do that the same way Bitcoin wants to deal with the Federal Reserve System. We think that the public school system is completely corrupt and unproductive. We don't think it teaches math because math is problem solving, not filling out forms for the DMV. And we're trying to do that just by competing, just by building something that works so much better and is so much more fun that they can't even claim to provide that service anymore. So check it out and give us some feedback. And I think we've got about 40 levels up there now that'll take you through programming recursive functions. And we'll look forward to your thoughts on it. Anybody that's interested.
Awesome. Well, as always, it's been an interesting conversation. You're always my favorite ANCAP to talk to dive into these subjects with, because you're so well spoken when it comes to this stuff, and you really know your shit. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, man. Ton of fun, and thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks for coming on. All you freaks out there, peace and love.